Yeah, I think that what I was interested in was like my background or experience with role playing games is John DM'd a game of Sorcerer. We did that for about a year. Then we started playing Legendary Lives, and for some reason that really clicked with me. And we've been playing that with Mark as well. And John's been DMing that. And then I also was like, oh, this is so much fun. I kind of get it now, and started DMing at the beginning of the pandemic a game of Legendary Lives with some of my college friends, using some of the same ideas that John had brought into Legendary Lives over from Sorcerer. So the idea of like having a kicker that's based off of, some of the your character's backstory.
Right.
So I kind of got that side of the role playing game thing. I'm into that. I get it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I've also had experiences playing the I guess like Tunnels and Trolls or Tunnel Goons, and there's another, Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeon Crawler Classics I've also played, which talking to John, it seems to be that's I think John, you put it like those games are very built like the game master comes to it with a scenario, and the characters aren't necessarily fully fledged, as opposed to Legendary Lives, where maybe there's not a fully fledged scenario, but the characters are really fully fledged, and like narrative comes out of that.
Yeah.
So I was curious, especially about like the vein of like Legendary Lives and what else is in that side of the space, and like how that all fits.
Yeah, I mean, and like so, I think about this, borrowing, just, or stealing, taking ideas from Ron Edwards and Sorcerer and his other books. And so I tend to think about that, whether sort of rich kind of character as the center of focus, or sort of rich setting as the focus. And you generally want to, not necessarily, but a lot, it is a very effective technique to choose one or the other, but not both. Like, I'm not saying like it's impossible to have both, but like it seems like the most effective techniques in games fall into families where they're using one or the other of those techniques.
I I
And
do
I
have
think
a
the
yeah.
oh, sorry, what?
I was gonna say I actually have a thought about that based on the game we were playing last night. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
where
So we're playing Heavy Gear, which is like a mecha game. Well, they're called gears in it, and it has a pretty detailed setting.
right,
Yeah,
right, and so I mean, just last night I was constantly like interrupting or spacing out to figure out what of all of this detail I should bring in. You know, we're trying to do this character based stuff with the characters they're playing while also having these these things from the setting from the book that someone's already described come in and try to like honor that material, and it can be difficult because there's so much, like if it's all about the characters then you can just improvise details of the setting, just throw them in as needed to embellish the character stories. Contrariwise, if it's all about the setting, then the characters will sort of the players will sort of find details that you're describing that are interesting to them, and they'll stick their characters to that detail and go from that way, right? And then in the heavy gear game, I'm kind of experiencing some cognitive struggles with the two things fighting to be the thing.
It's actually, it sounds like the problem that I was having when we played. Remember when we played that game Maze Rats, John? You kept
yes,
describing like the geography of like where we were and like how it related to where we came from. And I had a really, it was challenging for me to sort of visualize all of that and sort of keep it all in my head.
Yeah.
Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about, Rob?
Yeah, I think so. Just that you've got these two, when you've got like two sources of major, information, interesting information trying to come into the same space.
Yeah.
It's a lot to cognitively deal with, right? So.
And I think like I think there's kind of like two like so the when I think of like a good example of how like the other so if you think of like this kind of legendary life sorcerer school of like this kind of strong characters and then the situation and the setting is sort of based off of what the kind of players come up with for the characters. And the other school I think of something like the game RuneQuest where all of the player characters are pretty similar. Like there's not a lot of room to. I'm sorry, we're talking about the classic RuneQuest from like 1978 or whatever. There's not. You don't really differentiate them. There's no character classes. Like there's not really much to differentiate the characters. But the setting is meant to be very rich with these. Interesting situations that are kind of political, or there's supposed to be like powerful NPCs that you're supposed to exist in relation to, and so the interest in the characters you find out what's interesting about the characters as you play, and in terms of how the position you take towards this sort of rich setting material. So that's kind of the one way. But then you're in, and then so there's other ways, like the sorcerer school, which we use for legendary lives, and I think is a really effective way to play legendary lives because you do get that package of lifelines that you can then turn into a kicker or turn into something else. And the material in the legendary lives book is there. There's setting material, but it's fairly sketchy, or it's some of it isn't sketchy, but there's a lot to fill in. There's enough holes in it that you can kind of fill in and really make it your own. So it's really, I think, an effective way to do that. Other kind of big games in that family, and I think Ron would say that sort of where he got it from for Sorcerer, the main game, the most important game for that is Champions, which was not the first superhero role-playing game, but one of the first, and one of the first that's still really played today, or people kind of really care about. I'm not saying that matters, but Champions really hit early and really stuck, and I think it's more important than the other earlier games, just in terms of its history of game design, or its effect on the history of game design. And so what Champions did was, the idea behind Champions, which is pretty interesting in the original text, is it gave you tools to do what the folks who are making Marvel comics were doing in the 60s and 70s, which is to kind of make up a superhero and have them exist sort of right now. Like, so they were not, the setting in Champions is just like, the implied setting is just like what's going on right now outside your door. It isn't like, you don't need to it isn't like super detailed, like, you didn't play Champions by coming up with this like book of lore about the superheroes in this world. You sat down with the people at your table and each made a superhero character, and the character creation had these things called, like, I think they were called disadvantages in the original text, but they weren't. So they were kind of problems your character had, whether it was like a secret identity, like having to manage a secret identity, having a dependent character, like who was causing them problems. So like example would be like Peter Parker with his Aunt May. Like Aunt May was always kind of on his mind and always sort of weighing on him. So you had these characters who were created that not only had kind of powers but also had these kind of problems, and the game was meant to kind of spiral out of exploring those how those problems and how those powers sort of interact with with everything else, and you didn't have like it's kind of like a proto kicker, or you can kind of see where like I think where Sorcerer gets the idea for the kicker in a certain way from like saying like, okay, there's this package of kind of problems that this guy has, you know, how are those problems going to affect him in a way that pushes him into action.
Right, with that kind of so character first design, it's important for the character to have some sort of like built into creating the character is creating some sort of forward motor where you can see with this sort of like dungeon crawl game, well, there's kind of a default goal of getting more money and more power, and you sort of can just walk in with a pretty sketchy idea, and maybe you develop the character more fully, or maybe you just play the competitive, or you just enjoy the flavor and enjoy like the trying to get the stuff right. So sorry, did I derail your point, or I?
No, I think that's definitely, yeah. I think that's an important point, because if you have, if you're playing a game like Champions or Sorcerer, and you're kind of not proactive, and you don't kind of build a character that's proactive, it can be. It then becomes like the game master's responsibility to sort of hit your character with stuff, so that being reactive, so that one of the interesting things about playing Sorcerer, which I noticed when I first played, is that if you play reactively, it is painful. Like if you approach it like I'm just going to react to what the GM is doing, then like you get slammed and you get really beaten up. You kind of have to have that forward thing. And Champions, I think, is similar, that if you play your characters as just like reacting to everything, they're always going to be a step behind, and the villains are going to kind of get ahead of them and be able to like do their nefarious plots. But yeah, Champions is another big one that fits in that family. And I guess that's the big one I'm familiar with.
And of course, in Champions, there's Ron Edwards recently released a kind of a rewrite of it called Champions Now, which, I think John's been playing it, I've been playing it. But the original Champions he was playing, I think, was the 3rd edition from 1981, that's in a kind of a powder blue book about this big. And then as the 80s went on, like, they came out with more new editions that were thicker and thicker as they tried to get the game to be more generic and do more stuff. But the 3rd edition Champions and Champions Now is kind of where I think we're at with what's interesting in that realm.
And the other thing they did, they added more rules, but they also added more lore. So like later Champions, it is no longer kind of the implied world of later Champions is not just like what's going on outside you. It's actually an explicit like superhero universe with like the established
they've got their own
Champions characters
version
and,
of Hydra.
So
and all this.
Yeah,
stuff.
People got really into some people who were playing who kept following the game got really into that, following that universe. Whether or not they were actually playing the game was like not as important to them as like this universe or whatever. But having said that, I think there are like these detailed kind of fantasy universes or fantasy things that are really cool and can lead to great gaming, like the RuneQuest I was talking about. But it is kind of I think a different set of techniques for sure. I don't know. Were you looking for like other examples of games that might do that or be kind of, because I think a lot of character-driven games historically, or games with these kind of elaborate characters, there's like a danger. I think of it as like the GURPS danger, and GURPS is this game from the mid. It started developing in the early '80s, but it's published in like in late '80s. and for purpose of what I want to talk about, GURPS allowed you to. It stands for Generic Universal Role Playing System, and the idea was you when you're creating a character, you have a certain amount of points, and you can kind of really customize your character exactly what you want them to be, and they had, and it was kind of it was superficially similar to what you saw in Champions, which is you could buy these disadvantages and you could kind of give your character a list of these problems, or the disadvantages gave you more points to like buy other stuff. So you kind of point by your character and kind of really create this really evocative portrait of like who you thought your character would be, with a lot of finely detailed stuff. Like you could give him like, you know, there was like skills for everything and like kind of disadvantages for all these things. So you could really kind of create this kind of portrait that was really evocative. But the game itself didn't really tell you how to make that go. So in a game like GURPS, you end up with potentially like this sort of evocative character that you really want to play, but then the game itself sort of then leaves you with this sort of, you know, picture of a character that's just kind of sitting there. It isn't kind of dynamic or in motion, because its ideas about kind of what to do with those disadvantages or what to do with these things weren't really fleshed out.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think
It was
GURPS
similar
may
to
be
lives, right? Like Legendary Live by default, like didn't seem to tell you much about how to play, right? Like
that's true, but I think the difference in Legendary Lives is that the lifelines leave you with a character who's poised to care about certain things.
Yeah.
Where like you can't get out of that character creation process without a character who has like just cares about doing something, or someone out there cares about doing something to them. Whereas GURPS lets you kind of create this sort of, there's nothing
static kind of portrait,
it kind of channels you to make the character be in motion in a way that Champions does in its own way, and then like Legendary Lives does in its own way. That Sorcerer does very explicitly with, you know, what's great about Ron's games like Sorcerer and then Champions Now, which is his like Ron was saying, like his revision of Champions, is that he like not only does the stuff that works, but then like will sort of he understands why it works, so he'll kind of explain like why this works and why you're doing it this way. Whereas a lot of other games, I think, stumbled on, you know, a lot of other games work or are very effective. I mean, there's lots of great games, but that knowledge of like the theory behind it isn't.
Yeah, I mean that GURPS kind of lineage of that GURPS stuff kind of created this lineage of, I think, of games that are where they're like, the designers are like, well, what a role-playing game book is rules to create a character and rules to fight or maybe make a skill check, but there's not an overall sense of the shape of the game or the cycle of the game, you know, in terms of you do something and then that results in a change. This is what Ron's always talking about. That results in a change your characters and situations, and then that sort of provides the gas to move into a different situation. And, you know, you could do that with GURPS, but it would be up to you. Like, for the most part, the books are not, they're thinking of themselves as just a, like, physics textbook for, you know, resolving events in this fictional world, but not what the people playing the game should be thinking about or doing is kind of how I see that having gone in the 80s and 90s. I'm sorry. I feel like I got you off track again, but
I think it's true, because and so no, I don't think I'm off track. But I'm trying to think of like other kind of games in the family of like that.
I think that's actually like totally enough to. I mean, if you think of more, let me know. But I think that's let me research Champions Now or Champions and Champions Now potentially.
Champions, I highly recommend Champions Now for a lot of reasons. Like even if you're not interested in playing a superhero game, like at the moment, it has I think some of the best discussion about superheroes and kind of how to do a role playing game that I've come across. So I think it's worthwhile looking at. I was thinking about that a lot in when we played Legendary Lives 2. So I was kind of doing because we haven't played in a month or so, but I'm still jamming champions now for some guys, my brother and our buddies.
I guess the last kind of piece of this, and I don't know if I'm quite capable of like capturing it or forming it into sentence that makes sense, but like it feels like what happened when I've played Legendary Lives is like I end up with this character, and the motivations are meaningful to me in part because like I created them, right? Or like at least like put my own understanding on top of it because we did the random character creation, and it feels like that is more inherently motivating, and like I feel like there are like a lot like a varied and interesting set of themes that come out of play when doing Legendary Lives, whereas and it's more immediate, whereas I feel like in Dungeon Crawler Classic or whatever, that's either like imposed from the game master, which feels less engaging to me as a player, or it just takes a while to get there. Like I feel like we're starting to get there to know our characters enough in Tunnels and Trolls, where I'm like, oh, I'm starting to understand like the conflicts my character might have, other beyond just like I want money and I don't want to die, which is like a type of story, but
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I think I think that like that kind of reason to play to get to get to be creating those types of get to be like discovering this kind of interesting thematic material as these characters like in Legendary Lives go off and do their stuff. I think that's a different that's like a different kind. I mean, like I think it's a different kind of enjoyment or pleasure than you can get out than you generally would get out of like Dungeon Crawl Classics as we would traditionally want that played. I think that I think it's kind of in Tunnels and Trolls, and it's kind of Rod has been talking about, the pleasure is meant to be a little bit maybe more competitive and more like, okay, let's push our luck and see if we can go up against it. And I've been not as good a part of the reason I wanted to change the Tunnels and Trolls is because that's the type of game I wanted it to be, but Tunnel Goons really wasn't kind of providing the same push. But I think Tunnels and Trolls will, so I think we'll get to see if this kind of having fun to push our luck with that and kind of challenge the challenge based thing might be more fun, or we might get some more fun from it than it has been.
Right.
But I do think they're different things. Like I don't think it's going to be the same, even if they're both kind of fun.
If I could make a suggestion on that front, I wonder, like, is there an explicit level that the Necromancer's Tower is and that other dangerous things in the area are? Because that's one of the big things in Tunnels and Trolls is you go to the X level of the dungeon and you get experience points just for going to the harder level.
Yeah. And
so for that to be motivating, for us to be able, like, we have to know what level things are, kind of.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
that's
we have
true.
to think, okay, we're ready for this, like, 6th level, like, swamp or cave or whatever. Let's give it a shot. Let's see if we can we can get in there, and I think because that's about engaging us as players of the game, right? Not necessarily about thinking about, but what would Rochambeau feel ready for the 6th level? I'm not really thinking about that. I'm thinking about what I want to do, or what I want to see us do in the game, or experience in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, I think that it's a matter of, I do think it's like a matter of style that you can like fine tune to the table, whether it's like, whether you are just kind of explicit, like, okay, the I mean, I can be explicit, the Necromancer's Tower has sort of 4 levels, but you'll see when you get there, there's like 2 first level areas and then a 2nd level area and a 3rd level area in terms of its power. So it is sort of like a dungeony type environment. But I think other ways to play Tunnels and Trolls is to be, to kind of make that a little more vague, or to be a little more, or give you or kind of be explicit, but then you can take the opportunity to say, like, okay, I think like a level 4 area is probably too much for us, but let's push our luck and see. Yeah. I think that's part of Tunnels and Trolls too. Yeah, like, okay, I don't think we're quite ready for 4th level, but if we get down there, we get that extra experience, and maybe it's worth it to try it.
Right.
I don't know.
So if I'm understanding all this right, it sounds like if I'm looking for, like, the enjoyment to come out of this in the form of, like, a rich character arc, that's probably not the kind of game that this leads to, in part just because you want to have high physical stakes that the character could die, and that's like...
Yeah, that's a good part of it. I tend to approach this type of game when I'm a player, and it's not like I've done a ton of playing, but I played sort of the house ruled version of like the original Dungeons & Dragons 1974 rules for, I don't know, like 10 years ago, and then played some older Dungeons & Dragons recently. I tend to like to kind of give myself a character and kind of make a lot of these strategic choices through the prism of like what my guy would do as part of the challenge, to kind of make it kind of more fun for me. But it isn't the same as like what I'm trying to do like in the heavy gear game with my character, which is like, okay, I'm kind of concerned about her like what's important to me. Like, we do have these mecha battles where we're fighting with these giant robots with each other, and I want to win those. But what's important to me is, or what's interesting to me about the character and wanting to see what happens is like, what's her attitude towards the conflict overall, and her position as a soldier in it. Like, how is her own understanding of her self as being part of this, perhaps like, sort of, I don't know, kind of fundamentalist religious kind of quasi-war, or like, Cold War, low-grade, war. What is her attitude about that? That's what's interesting to me about that character and that game. And kind of winning the combats or playing the combats is important because that gives us context for the character kind of choices and the themes that are being played. But if I lost the combat, I wouldn't feel like I lost the game or cared. I wouldn't mind losing the combats in the same way that if I was playing like Dungeons and Dragons and my character died, it's like, okay, I lost that in a way that's like I mean, it's like, yeah, I kind of lost. I pushed my luck too far and my dude died.
So it sounds like kind of what you're saying here is that those sort of dungeon crawl games were sort of the traditional, came first, basically. Those are sort of the traditional games, and then these other games developed from players who were bringing these other values to them, and wanted to actually create a game where those values were central. Is that the way that it worked kind of historically?
Pretty much, although it seems to have happened pretty quickly that people started playing Dungeons and Dragons with those priorities.
Right.
like
Yeah.
people started playing with like priorities of like character.
Yeah, and it's
kind of
interesting to
thematic
know.
stuff.
Yeah, like you were talking about in the heavy gear game, all of that stuff about the fights leading to these values conflicts is possible because they're positioned in a situation where it's like an actual, it is like an actual conflict. You're soldiers, you're not. Whereas if you're, a lot of Dungeons and Dragons games, the starting point is you just make up a character who's just this sort of wandering weirdo who wants to go get gold and there's not kind of a clear picture of what these characters are doing in a society. And so I think that's kind of like step one. Like if you were to go for like rich character tunnels and trolls or whatever, like that would be step one, right? Probably creating some kind of values conflict that contextualizes these like trips to a dank cave to slay monsters, right? And then maybe you might have more of that coming out. And I'm actually, now that I think about it, I wasn't there for the whole Tunnel Goons sequence of the game, but some of that was kicking off, and it still is kicking off. But like you've observed, the question is, or like you were saying, George, it takes a while to get going, and the question is, well, could it not take a while? Could it get going like right away in a game like this? And I don't know. Maybe it could. I haven't tried, but that's.
And I would just, I think that's true. And I would just say that to kind of just circle back to the beginning point again, though, that you can, like, what's important to note about something like RuneQuest, though, is that it still is like I'm saying, it still is you start with a sketchy character with this kind of more interesting setting, and you do end up making kind of thematic choices, but so it is that type of kind of RuneQuest is like the quintessential game of like, people play Dungeons and Dragons and they're like, okay, we can do more with this that's more thematically and literarily ambitious. We can do kind of more ambitious stuff with this role playing stuff, but still the way RuneQuest works is that you kind of, everyone starts with a sort of generic, very similar player character, and then they make their, like, the character comes into more focus and kind of becomes interesting by the choices they make with regard to this kind of very rich situation and setting. And in RuneQuest, if you play by the book, your characters actually start as 16-year-olds. So that is actually sort of part that actually kind of plays into that formally, that like, okay, you are meant to be sort of an unformed person even in the game world. So
when did RuneQuest get developed?
1978 to 1980 was like the rules. The world existed before that. Like it kind of,
there was a board game actually.
It was like a board game and set in this fantasy world, and then they wrote a series of rules to play characters in it.
Yeah, and that's actually
RuneQuest is cool. Yeah.
The RuneQuest system is the ancestor of the Call of Cthulhu and all those other Chaosium games. So if you're interested in keeping track of that at all, but
yeah, we played Call of Cthulhu earlier this last year, turn of the year over the winter. But yeah, RuneQuest would be a good one for us to check out at some point.
And so you're specifically talking about like the RuneQuest second edition, I think, is the one that's available in like a facsimile of the original book that was reprinted.
Yeah.
And then there's a current RuneQuest edition that's a huge book with tons of, that's different, like it borrows stuff from Pendragon and like it's kind of the same basic thing but with a bunch of expansion material. I don't understand it necessarily. Maybe I should stop talking about it, but
I
anyway,
think that's
just to say
it's
what
compatible.
Yeah, what products you would be looking for, or what books you would be looking for if you want to do investigate that.
Me?
Or George or whoever. But
Yeah, I mean, my thing is like on my list of things to do over the next year or so, it's like there's a lot on it, but like I'm now, one of the things is I wanted to do the tunnels and trolls, so like that's it. I would like to do RuneQuest, and then the other thing I would like to do is the fantasy trip, which is like the other big early-ish someone's attempt to do a better version of Dungeons and Dragons, essentially, like kind of. I think Tunnels and Trolls, RuneQuest, and the Fantasy Trip are the three big games that people made in reaction to Dungeons and Dragons. Is that like, we can do this better for different meanings of the word better in each case.
right, and as a point of minor interest relevant to what you were talking about earlier, right, the Fantasy Trip is actually a predecessor of GURPS in terms of rules DNA or publishing DNA, you know. So
And I think my playing around with it seems like I think it has a little bit more. I think it goes better than GURPS. I think it's easy. I think it it kind of. It has
it's
more
got
like
more
this,
of a built-in.
What do you do with it? You can kind of figure it out. Anyways, so that's kind of my things I'd like to explore at some point. So I mean, RuneQuest would be cool for us to explore at some point, but I would want to do like the kind of classic, 1980 or so RuneQuest, because I think that's, I don't know.
I mean, it's
Not
got
that
all
against
the.
newer stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the 1980 one I think has all of the basic ideas in it. It's got that map of Dragon Pass and like the information about this conflict between this empire and these barbarian tribes that sort of contextualizes what's going on in the setting. So, I mean, that's kind of no reason not to start there. Anyway.
But yeah.
Right. I think I'm gonna hop off, but I appreciate the exposure to that much.
Yeah, the answer is we should play RuneQuest and we should play Champions.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, at some point. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds good. Yeah.
I think also I'll get more out of Tunnels and Trolls. I think by like engaging, like being more tactical about the rules and like the playing it more gamey. I think trying to engage with it on that level, I'll get more out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The-